Not gonna lie to you. A little out of sorts. You know how dumb things mess you up? So I brought a shirt today, and this shirt has this collar that stands up really high. And then, and this is really stupid, but you think about what you're gonna wear, right? And you wanna be comfortable. And it has this collar that's really high, and it always does this. And we happened to send this service's video to the River Church, and I did it in it anyway, so I should have just left the shirt on. Now I'm really uncomfortable. I just want to share that with you so that you can share in my discomfort and we can get rolling. Everybody good? All right. Stupid things always get you. So here's the deal. We're in the Mountain of God series. So let me give you the rundown how we got here, because we're really camping in a singular story. And I'm gonna, we do this, we're gonna do this every week in this series, because when you're camping in a singular story, how you got to where you got is important. And so we start, you start out, and basically the Mountain of God, it's Mount Sinai. And this is the place where heaven meets earth. That's the literary device that's being used, but it's also the place where God has met in the Bible with, he met with Moses and he met with Elijah there. And so it's a special place. And look, I think a lot of times in our world, in our culture, we don't recognize that there are some places that are special. It's not special because God resides there, but it's special because of what he did there. And we should commemorate those things, right? And so that's kind of Mount Sinai. God does not reside at the top of Mount Sinai. We're not talking about Greek mythology. This isn't Mount Olympus, but it is a special place because God did meet with people there. And so the nation of Israel was enslaved in Egypt, and through the 10 plagues and the story, if you don't know the story, watch Prince of Egypt. It's okay, pretty close. And also your kids will like it. And so after that, they get out and they go on this journey, and they're journeying to the promised land, and they end up at Sinai, which is like actually it's kind of out of the way, to be honest. If you look at it on a map, it doesn't really make any sense how they got there, but God led them there. And so they end up there 2 months after exiting Egypt, and they're at the base of the mountain. You start the whole series of events starts in Exodus 19. God sets up the rules for interacting with him at the foot of Mount Sinai, and then he announces to all the people the 10 Commandments. And foundationally, these are just these are the guidelines by which the Israelites are to conduct themselves, right? And the rest of the law is delivered from, or not the whole rest of the law, but the portion that's in Exodus, it's enumerated in Exodus, is delivered from chapter 20 of Exodus through chapter 31. And so, but he announces, and he delivers that to Moses, but he announces the law to the 10 Commandments to all the people. He announces it to all the people, and they get freaked out because they met with God and it terrified them, right? And so they look at Moses and they're like, hey, could you talk to him? Because if we keep doing this, we're going to die, right? And Moses is like, hey, don't freak out. God did this for a reason. So you can recognize how big and how great he is in light of who you are, and you can have the proper reverence and all for him, right? And that's the interaction, but still Moses goes up the mountain, right? And so he goes up the mountain, he gets the law. The law is built from the 10 Commandments. And this is a good thing to say, this is a good thing to remember for us, which is you have to know your guiding principles. That's why God gave that to them first. Like at some point, you just have to be able to rely on the first principles. Like life gets complicated, and we often think that when life gets complicated, when the complexities of life start to overwhelm us, that what we need is to have complex solutions. But complex solutions to complex problems just create more complexity. And I don't know, it just feels like in the last 5-6 years, I've lived through that, and I thought really complicated solutions would fix it, and it didn't. And I came back to what? First principles. That's why God gave the 10 Commandments to all of the Israelites. And then he enumerated the rest of the law to Moses so that he could convey it as they could understand it. You see what I'm saying? So anyway, they send him up the mountain, he's up the mountain, and he's gone too long, and they freak out. They're like, maybe he died. You have to remember that they thought that they would die if they spent too much time in the presence of God. So for them to think that Moses died in the presence of God, that's logical. That's their logical next solution. So then they look at Aaron, who's the second in charge, and the priest, the guy who's representing the spiritual aspect of this, and they're like, hey, why don't you build for us gods that we can worship? And you think when you read that, you see it on the text and it sounds silly, because if we can build God, he's obviously not God, right? But we do that all the time, because when we find ourselves feeling unimportant, we create things more important so that we can then have something to worship. We're made to worship. We are made to do that, because you think, oh, I'm not made, dude, I don't even like the music. I'm not made to worship. Like, you're crazy. Worship is it's not just singing along to songs. Worship is actually more wholly considered. It's actually, who do you serve? Who do you pour yourself out on behalf of? And we're made for that. We need purpose. We need direction. We need a place to put all this energy he's given us, And so they say, build us a God so that we can worship. And so Aaron says, give me all your gold and I'll make one. And he makes one, and then there's this golden calf, and they get really excited about the golden calf, because, it's something to worship. It's something to put all this energy that's pent up in us towards, And, this actually tracks with us if you think about it, because when we find purpose outside of what God has given us as our purpose, when we make gods out of things, we're excited about them for a time. If you spend years and years and years saving up and salivating and thinking on and believing on, like, getting this one car, and I don't know, I'm a dude, so insert your thing, right? But I grew up and I grew up in the 90s, and if I were to set a car as my goal, as the thing I would live my life to serve, it would be a 1996-ish Dodge Viper. Right? Just beautiful car. Now, if I had set that up as my goal, as my God, as my thing that I'm going to worship, pour myself out on behalf of, right? Then I would get it and I would be pumped. And about 12 speeding tickets later, I would hate it. So it's intuitive that they love the calf and they get excited about the calf, but also they would eventually come to hate it. And we see that because the things we idolize, we eventually demonize. And so they get excited, and Aaron's glad they're excited. So he's like, we're going to have a party tomorrow. We're going to have a party. We're going to have a festival to this new God. And they're like, awesome. And they start to have the festival. And God's not happy. Because this is what they say. This, O Israel, is the God that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. They built it. But somehow it brought them up out of the land of Egypt. Right? So God looks at Moses and he says, those people, your people. You ever had that fight with your wife? You come home, your kid's been, yep, your kid. What? You know what, your kid today? Ho, I just got here. Also, it's half yours, right? And I'm gonna go ahead and say that problem's your half of the genetics. I don't know. I've never said that, not once. Never thought it either. My wife's here, so I never thought it either. And so that's God's response. He's like, I'm gonna wipe them out. I'm going to wipe them out, and I'll start over with you, Moses. You're the only one who has good intentions. You're the only one who's serving me. I'm going to wipe them out, and I'm going to start over with you. And Moses intercedes on behalf of his people with God, right? And God, it says in verse 14 of chapter 32, and God changed his mind. And this is one of those deals that people get all confused over, because it's like, hey, how can an unchanging God change his mind? Like, that seems counterintuitive. I don't understand. And my whole stance on this is I don't really care. If I can pray and it can change his mind, I'm going to not worry about the specifics, and I'm going to pray like it matters. Right? Like, that's it. That's it. And so, and then the beginning of verse 15, Moses turns from God and walks down the mountain to speak to the people. God's changed his mind. He's not going to destroy the people. Now Moses has got to go deal with these people that he's going to be leading, that he is leading. And at the end of the day, what the series is a series on spiritual leadership. And look, we do a bad job of leading spiritually. We do a bad job of seeing the people that God places in our lives as people that God's put there for a reason. You know, we just like, we don't think about why God may have put someone in our path. We just think I like them or I don't. You know, we just think I enjoy them or they make me want to sleep. We just think I want to spend more time with them or I'd rather be doing something else, right? But God's put people in your life. He's given you people, and he's given you people to be able to have some effect on their lives. And look, if they're in your life, then you have some level of influence on them. And if you have some level of influence on them, you have some level of responsibility to lead them. That influence is given by God, and you have purpose in that influence. And so where we pick up is the second half of chapter 15, and how we're going to be unpacking this portion. You got to roll with me on this because it gets a little bit hairy at the end. And I recognize up front, we'll get there. I'm about to read it. We'll get there. You'll hear it and you'll be like, oh my gosh. And like, I understand it gets a little hairy, but we're going to roll with it. Everybody good? It's the Old Testament. So it gets a little, We're going to pick up in the second half of verse 15. We're going to go to verse 29. The title of this one is Be a Standard Bearer. Be a standard bearer. Be somebody. A standard bearer, if in military terms, was the person who got handed the flag. Right? And in old school military times, a person gets handed the flag. That is a super important person because that person is holding the flag of the unit that they serve in. And if that person is in the right place, then the general can then make the whole army move the way that he needs it to move. That person is crucial. But without that person, he doesn't know who's where. Right? And so standard bearers are super important, and they have to be super loyal to the orders and the desires of the leader. In our scenario, this would be God. We need to be someone who is super on top of, super in line with and aligned with what God desires for us so that we can be in the right place at the right time doing the right things. And if we're not, then what are our efforts worth, And so that's let's go. We're going to be in verse 15 through 29. Then Moses turned and went down the mountain. He held in his hands the 2 stone tablets inscribed with the terms of the covenant. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back. These tablets were God's work. The words on them were written by God himself. When Joshua heard the boisterous noise of the people shouting below them, he exclaimed to Moses, "It sounds like a war in the camp." But Moses replied, "No, it's not a shout of victory, nor the wailing of defeat. I hear the sound of a celebration." When they came near the camp, Moses saw the calf and the dancing. He burned with anger. He threw the stone tablets on the ground, smashing them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf they had made and burned it. Then he ground it into powder and threw it into the water and forced the people to drink it. Finally, he turned to Aaron and demanded, "What did these people do to you to make you bring such terrible sin upon them?" "Don't get so upset, my lord," Aaron replied. "You yourself know how evil these people are. They said to me, 'Make gods who will lead us.' We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt. So I told them, 'Whoever has gold jewelry, take it off.' And when they brought it to me, I simply threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Moses saw that Aaron had let the people get completely out of control, much to the amusement of their enemies. So he stood at the entrance to the camp and shouted, "All of you who are on the Lord's side, come here and join me." And all the Levites gathered around him. Moses told them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Each of you, take your swords and go back and forth from one end of the camp to the other. Kill everyone, even your brothers, friends, and neighbors." The Levites obeyed Moses' command, and about 3,000 people died that day. Then Moses told the Levites, "Today you have ordained yourselves for the service of the Lord, for you obeyed him, even though it meant killing your own brothers and sisters. Today you have earned a blessing." Now, the last 2 verses in our context seem repulsive. Is that the right word? Very uncomfortable. Everybody good? So let's just start here. I want to get this out of the way and then we can unpack the rest. Does that work? So So Moses says basically the question is, who did not worship at the foot of that golden calf? And so the Levites come over and he's like, all right, you men draw your swords, go through the camp, kill everybody. Now you read it and you go, okay, that seems super brutal. And then 3,000 died that day. Okay, that seems extra super brutal. You have to unpack all of these events a couple of different ways. First of all, you have to unpack it this way. This is an ancient solution to an ancient problem. Meaning, if you overlay contemporary morals on top of it, you will judge without correct context. Like, you can't do that. As far as history goes, you can't be like, oh, I think that's wrong. Okay, you can think that's wrong now, but you can't judge the person who said it then, right? Because you don't know. Everybody good? Like, that's the way you got to read historical texts. If you do that, if you overlay contemporary morals on ancient texts, every single leader of all time ever is evil, right? Because we just have such a different view of the way that things should be, and thank God for it. I'm not mad about it. You know, thank God for it, but that just is what it is. The second piece that you have to unpack here is at the top of the mountain, God said he was going to kill all of them. And at the bottom of the mountain, 3,000 died. Now unpack this for a second. That number ended up in the Bible for a reason. It did. It wouldn't have ended up there for no reason. It ended up there for a reason. And when we read it, we read brutality. I would suspect that when the ancient Israelites read this, as the story was retold to them, they read mercy. Because God had decided he wanted to kill 3 million people. You understand? 600,000 men left Egypt. That means that anywhere, the most conservative estimate of the population of the nation of Israel is 1.5 million, when you account for women and children. The more likely is around 3 million. And so at the top of the mountain, God was going to wipe everybody out. And at the bottom of the mountain, Moses said, kill everybody, and 3,000 people died. I'm not trying to justify it. I'm trying to say, if you put yourself in the shoes of ancient people reading this, they're not reading brutality. They're reading mercy. The third thing that you have to unpack, and this is just completely practical, how do you lead 3 million former slaves that are now nomadic, that have never had to be nomadic before, through treacherous terrain in mountainous territory with enemies all around? How do you do it? And how do you maintain order? Now, is that an excuse for Moses? Is that an excuse? I don't know. God doesn't get mad at Moses. I don't know. Everybody's got to come to their own conclusions on this, right? But I would just submit to you that the original readers probably saw God's mercy and his grace. Does that work for everybody? Can we move on past it? All right. So let's start back from the beginning. In verse 15, Moses turns and goes down the mountain, right? And he holds in his hand the 2 stone tablets from God. He has God's standard in his hands. He has the law in his hands. He's holding God's standards, what God expects of his people, in his hands. As he's walking down the mountain, they start to hear the celebration. They start to hear the festival. They start to hear all the craziness. And so they're descending the mountain, and Joshua's like, oh, it sounds like war. And Moses is like, that ain't war, man. That's a party. You must not have been to one. And they keep going, and the anger within him starts to rage, and he slams the tablets on the ground, and then he eventually goes straight into action. The first point here, as far as be a standard bearer, is this: you have to set the standard. You have to set the standard. You have to set God's standard. That's what you have to set. That's what you have to know it first, but Moses knows it. He spent time in God's presence. If you're going to be a spiritual leader, you should know God's standard for your life. You should know the truth that you need to speak. You should know how to represent him well. And then when the time comes, you should do it. You should set the standard. This doesn't mean that you walk around judging people, right? Like that, I fear, I was talking with Pastor Logan just before this, and one of the things I fear from like American Christian tradition, we have these extremities, and you have the people who are like, yeah, set the standard, let's go. And so you walk around judging everybody. Meanwhile, you're kind of a turd, you know? Or you have this other extremity where it's like, I'm not gonna judge anybody, I'm just gonna kind of let it play out, and I just love everybody, and I think I can hug everybody into heaven. If I just hug them hard enough and long enough, they'll make it. And we have these extremities, and I fear both extremes because the people who are judgmental and just meh, well, nobody likes them, and they don't help anybody. And that's not what setting the standard looks like. You can't expect for somebody who doesn't believe what you believe to believe what you believe. Like you can't expect somebody who's not a Christian to act like a Christian. You can't expect somebody who follows Jesus or who doesn't follow Jesus to act like somebody who follows Jesus. It just doesn't work, right? And so when we go around poking everybody in the eye, all we do is make them hate Jesus more because they hate us. But then when we go on the flip side and we don't ever have any standards and we're just like, well, we see what happens with that. We've lived through it. We did not, in the last 10 years, Christians have not stood for very many standards. We've just kind of been like, hey, we're going to let this play out. And in times where our values get attacked, what do? Well, I'm not saying fight back. I'm just saying speak truth. I'm just saying like, hey, you guys can go that way. I'll be right here. This is going to get really uncomfortable. In 2020, they told us not to go to church. And we didn't. There are biological realities. I'm not denying that. But there is also a biblical mandate to gather together. Then we started, it's going to get really uncomfortable. Y'all good? And then, there's no such thing as man and woman. God made them man and woman. Now there are biological realities that we're going to deny. Like setting the standard doesn't look like, I hate you because you believe something different, or hey, don't be a sheep. It looks like, no, they said don't go to church, I'll be there. Because I need to be with my brothers and sisters in Christ. I don't know. It's just what the Bible says. Doesn't mean like, hey, I hate you because you think you're deranged, you think something different. It just means like, no, I'll pray for you. Because God says that he made them man and woman, and these realities matter. They're kind of the basis of civilization that he gave us. Like, I don't hate you. I just think you're wrong and lost. And I love you. Setting the standard means loving God's way even when it's really uncomfortable. It means living God's way even when culture tells you not to. Come on. It means being places that other people say you shouldn't be, but God said be there, so be there. It means standing on truth that other people are running from. You don't need to, like I'm not saying weaponize it. I'm not saying rub it in people's faces. I'm saying humbly stand and don't move. That's what Moses does with Joshua. And that's why this is important. Joshua thinks that there's war. Moses knows that there's debauchery. Joshua, obviously by his reaction, is not privy to the information that God had given Moses. He was at the top of the mountain, but he must not have been a part of the conversation, right? Because God says, your people have denied me. Joshua doesn't know that. He thinks there's a war in the camp. And so now what Moses does in front of Joshua will dictate what Joshua believes is the right thing to do in this moment. If Moses doesn't set the standard here, the next leader for Israel doesn't happen. If Moses doesn't set the standard here, generations will be screwed up. If Moses doesn't set the standard here, the man who leads the nation into the promised land will be misled. He'll be misinformed. He will not know the foundations that he stands on. God has given you people to lead, and if you don't if you don't know his standard, and if you don't stand on it, you will lead them astray. And here's the problem. You're like, okay, no, you don't understand the gravity of that, because if you lead them astray, you lead astray everyone else that they influence. This cascades, this ripples through time. When God says that I will bless you in 100 generations, that's because what happens in reality is that the effects of our lives ripple through time. And that's true on the good end and the bad end. I had a grandparent who had some real bad hangups. We'll just put it that way. I'll be generous. And I, like a grandparent, my dad, awesome. I grew up fearing that I would become like my grandfather. Like 60 years later, because I knew that the darkness that lived in him lived in me. Even with like a disruptor in the middle, even with a godly man in the middle, I feared the darkness that I knew lived in him. These things ripple through time. You have to set the standard because people are looking at you. I guess I left a point out. You got to know it first. You got to know it first. Moses was holding it in his hands. You walk around every day with it in your pocket. The Bible app is free. Use it. Know it. And it's got all sorts of good plans in it that remind you. Dude, your Bible can notify you to read it. There's no excuse anymore. Like it used to be like, oh, I just didn't sit in that chair today. You put it in your pocket every morning. And it can bother the crap out of you. Matter of fact, they do a little streak thing in the Bible app where it tells you how many days in a row you opened it. It can guilt trip you better than your mom. Know it, and then set it for those who follow you. The next thing, crush evil. I love this point because it's literal. Moses walks down the mountain, burns down the idol, and crushes it. But this is the thing, in your life, you gotta crush evil. You have to destroy it. So look at this. This is what happens to us, okay? Let me just read this. God uses life to uphold and uplift you. We see that in Romans chapter 8. He says, and we know that he works everything together for the good of those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. So God uses life and life circumstances to fortify you and to uphold you and to uplift you. That doesn't mean that everything's perfect. It just means that everything works together for your good. So the bad things turn into good things. And like we see that because when you look back on your life, the periods you grew the most were the periods that sucked the worst. Like the moments where you feel like you'll be completely destroyed are the moments when you look back and you go, man, I freaking climbed that mountain and stood on the top of it. And so we see that, but this is what happens. The enemy of your soul, Satan, the devil, evil, whatever you want to call it in our squishy gushy world, the devil uses life and its circumstances, and your vulnerabilities to disrupt God's goodness and remove you from its presence. And we see that too. That's obvious. Like this happened to me this week. This happened to me yesterday. So our youngest, right? She's either the greatest sleeper we have or the worst. And it all depends on how the car ride home goes. If she sleeps on the car ride home, not a chance. It's like she slept all night and she's ready to go, right? But if she doesn't sleep on the car ride home, she'll fall asleep in 5 minutes. So last night, she slept on the car ride home, and we had a long car ride because we came from here. So it was about a 30-minute car ride, she slept. And so we get home, and she wakes up, and I'm like, oh, no. So I let her come into the bedroom with me. We were watching TV, and I'm like, go to sleep. And she's like, okay, and then she starts singing, and I'm like, go to sleep. And then she's like, okay, and then she starts playing with her socks. And then I'm like, go to sleep. And then she's like, okay, and then she sits up, and she goes, I need water. And I'm like, you always need water. You wake up and say, I need water. Like, you don't need water. You're not thirsty. You're fine. Go to sleep. And she's like, okay, and then she does some other stuff. And then I'm like, we're gonna go to your bed. And she's like, okay, so then I take her to her bed. And then she lays there, and I'm like, go to sleep. She goes, okay, and then she's sticking her feet through the slats in the crib, and I'm like, go to sleep. And then she's like, yeah, okay, and then she rolls around in the blanket, and then I'm like, go to sleep. And then her head's on the foot of the bed, and I'm like, okay, this is ridiculous. And I'm like, I'm leaving. She's like, okay, and then I walk out, and she's like, no! At this point, I'm ready to fight, right? But she's like almost 2. You don't get to do that, right? I'm like, dude, if you were a grown man, we would be rolling right now. And it's, you understand, you've had these moments, right? It's ridiculous. You understand that your emotions are absolutely not called for, but that does not make them any less real. So I walk out of the room, and Amanda comes across the house, and she's like, I'll take care of her. She sounds so scared. And that mom thing, right? Like, oh, my baby. I'm like, no, right? Like, I'm being tough dad now. I'm like, she needs to cry and get it out, and then it'll all be better. And she says, okay, which is really sweet of her, because and she didn't bring it back up again. I was dead wrong. This girl puked within 30 seconds of starting to scream. Like, just the straight up panic response. Bleh. And I walk back in there, and by the way, my back's all jacked up last night, like super locked up, and she puked all over the ground, and I literally can't bend over to wipe it up. So now I have to sulk back into my bedroom and look at Amanda and be like, can you help me, please? So now I'm a bad dad. I'm angry still. All of these things, right? They start running in your head. What do? Straight up, make myself French fries and grilled chicken. Right? Which is a big stumbling block for me, because when I end up getting upset, instead of praying through it and actually becoming a better human being, I just eat. And I'm not saying it's sinful, I'm just saying it's not godly either. The devil won one. By the way, I fried the French fries in butter. Don't judge me. I heard a really judgmental awe. So anyway, my justification is the air fryer's too loud and everybody was asleep. So mostly I didn't want Amanda to know because I was ashamed. And she found out in the morning because there was a pan but whatever. Look, the devil will use the circumstances of life and your vulnerabilities to remove you from God's goodness, to deprive you of God's goodness and remove you from his presence. That means you have to make plans to systematically destroy the evil in your life. When you accepted Jesus, you're a new creation. The old, this is constructive, whether you like the ooga booga of it or not, whatever. You're a new creation, but that doesn't mean that the old demons go away. They're not you. They're detached from you. They don't live in you, but they also don't leave unless you make them. Flee from the devil and he will flee from you. You have to make a plan to systematically crush evil in your life. Moses, I'm sure, walking down that mountain, knew exactly what he was going to do. I'm going to burn that idol. I'm going to crush it up. They're going to drink it for the next 3 months. They will not forget the taste of the evil that has been brought upon them. And you're like, hey, all of this seems really dramatic. Like they made one mistake. No, it's not really dramatic, and they didn't make one mistake. They were given freedom, and they invited evil back into their lives. That is a complete denial of the grace and the goodness of God. We undermine the importance of sin in our lives, and we go, I just made a mistake. Listen, God can tell you you just made a mistake, but you need to realize the reality is you denied his grace. But in his grace, he'll say, it's okay. I got you. Right? There's a tension there, but you have to understand the depth of what it is that you've done. Because if you don't understand the depth of what it is that you've done, you don't understand the magnitude of his grace. And when you cheapen his grace, you cheapen his presence and you cheapen his goodness. The last one, this is the awkward one. Uphold his presence, or his standard. Uphold his standard. Uphold his standard. Now, I'm not pointing to the killing of the 3,000 people as Moses upholding his standard. Not because I don't think that's what's happening, but because I don't think it's constructive for us, right? As much as you have to say, as much as you believe that we can't judge ancient context from contemporary morals, and I believe that, the fact of the matter is you still live here and now. But what we can do is we can take the events on the front end and the back end of that and see how he upholds the standard. And because he says, who of you, like, those of you who didn't sin, come over here. If you're still on God's side, you come over here. And the Levites show up. The Levites become the priestly tribe. They become the ones, he sets an order here. They become the ones who are devoted to God and who end up being the priests of the nation of Israel. And he directs them through the camp. But then on the back end of that, he says in verse 29, today you have ordained yourself for the service of the Lord, for you obeyed even though it meant that killing your own sons and brothers today you have earned a blessing. And so he sets them up as the priestly tribe that will then conduct and oversee the spiritual health of the nation. He upholds the standard by setting a new route. And that's what you got to do. You got and you have to uphold God's standards in your life, and sometimes that means you have to reroute what you've been doing. You have to uphold a standard. You got to set it. Like you got to set it, and you got to set it in front of those who God has given you. You got to let them know where you stand and what you're standing on. And then you got to have a plan to systematically crush evil in your life so that it doesn't take over and remove you from God's presence and his grace. But then when push comes to shove, you got to be about what you talk about. You don't get to just say, this is where I am. You got to actually be there. You don't get to just say, like, I serve God. You got to actually serve him. And that, like, this is where it falls apart. We give it lip service, but then we don't do what we say. So if you're going to talk about it, be about it. Make a plan. Put safeguards in place. I'll tell you one that I screwed up this week, another one. Man, y'all gonna think I had a horrible week. Uphold his standard. So, we had a meeting on Monday, and we went through kind of what the push is going to be this year for each ministry section and all of that stuff. And one of the things that Josh and I agreed on for Sunday mornings is that we need to be praying for open hearts and minds. We need to be praying for open hearts and minds as they walk in the door. And by the way, if you want to do this, you're invited to do it. I'm going to set it in my phone at noon on Friday. Here's where I failed. If I am called to lead, and if I am called to stand on his principles and on his standard, then I am called to be about what I talk about. And I forgot to set it in my phone for 12 o'clock on Friday afternoons. I did not pray for you on Friday. When I said I would pray for you on Friday, on Monday. Why? Because I forgot. You're like, okay, it's not that big a deal. Like, none of y'all are going to hate me on the way out, probably. It's a big deal. If we think that what we do is of eternal consequence, if we believe in the power of prayer, if we believe that his presence and his spirit can change lives. Like, you don't forget to put on your underwear in the morning. And this is more important than that. It's a big deal. You have to uphold his standard. And if you're going to be about it, you're going to talk about it, be about it. Shouldn't have changed my shirt. Touched this dang microphone twice. And now I'm all hot. Really, this sermon is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to action. Who are you? Whose are you, more importantly? What does he expect of you? And what are you doing to meet those expectations? Let's pray. God, let us seek you in humility and let us see ourselves clearly so that we don't become arrogant and prideful. Reveal to us when we screw up and burden our hearts. Let us mourn. Let us mourn our failures and our sins so that we can understand the magnitude of your grace. Don't let us live in them, but let us feel them. And then God, give us the strength, give us the humility, give us the perspective to do what it is you've asked us to do, to be the leaders you've asked us to be, to do the hard things and to do the important things. We love you and we thank you. Amen.